Hi class, welcome to the first of many recorded videos you may be watching this year. Some of the videos you watch might be optional, some might be mandatory, but either way I hope they are beneficial for you and that they help you review the material that you've been learning in class or on your own so that you can feel more confident with the material that you're learning. So with that being said, just a reminder, I'm Mrs. Spaniel, and this is our first video. So we're going to start with the characteristics of life. And this week you have hopefully been learning about an introduction to biology, an introduction to safety, to lab handling, but also the subject of biology in general, and how the subject of biology is so vast and encompasses so many other aspects of science. And so that's what we'll be talking about in this short video today. Before we go on, I need to point out some learning targets, just things that I need you to keep in the back of your mind as we go throughout our video. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to identify characteristics of all living things, and you'll be able to describe the cross-cutting concepts of biology if you can't already do that. Let's get started. Before we go on, I want you to take some time and I want you to recap something you may have already done in class, and that is look at the difference between non-living and living things. Hopefully this is a review for you, and so you've already talked about and you already have a really good understanding of what makes something living or non-living. So we can take a second here, pause the video, and I want you to fill in the Venn diagram. On one side I want you to do living things, and on the other side I want you to do non-living things, and in the middle I want you to do characteristics that they both share. You can do things that you've learned in class, things that you've learned from your textbook, or something new that you've thought of. So take a second, pause the video, and then we'll go on. Now, we can actually talk about whether or not you're alive versus why the clouds are alive versus why something else might be alive. Because non-living and living things share a lot of characteristics, it often takes more than one thing to differentiate between something that's alive and something that's not alive. For example, a remote control car can still move just like you, but that doesn't necessarily mean a remote control car is alive. In a similar fashion, things like trees and fungi don't necessarily walk around or drive around, but that doesn't mean that they're not alive. So what are the things that we have to use to differentiate living versus non-living? How do you know the clouds aren't alive? They change shape, they move, they change size. What's making them non-living? And how do I know that you're actually alive and not a robot, right? And if robots did exist, what differentiates a robot from a normal human being? We can answer some of those questions. There are various characteristics of non-living things, and they all share a lot of these similarities. For starters, they're all made up of cells. Cells are the basic unit of life. In order for you to be considered alive, you have to be made up of cells. You might only be made up of one cell, which is possible, or you could be made up of hundreds of thousands, millions of billions of cells. Either way, in order for you to be alive, you have to be made up of cells. Organisms that are alive are also able to reproduce. The way they reproduce might be different. You have sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction, but reproduction happens either way. It doesn't matter if you're a single-celled organism or a multicellular organism, you still are able to reproduce. You might undergo binary fission, but that's still technically a type of reproduction. In addition, all living organisms are based on a universal genetic code. Any guess as to what that universal genetic code might be? If you guessed DNA, you guessed right. DNA is what's inside of our cells that kind of sets the stage for who and what you'll become. We'll spend a lot of time talking about DNA later on. In addition, all living things grow and develop. A lot of things can grow, even non-living things can grow. Think about those fun little grow animals, you know, have you ever had those, or like in a little pill container, or they're like a really tiny animal and you dump them in water and then all of a sudden they go from this to this. They grow, but that doesn't mean they're alive. They don't reproduce. They're not necessarily made up of cells. Those are things that can't happen. All living organisms at some point in their life have to grow and develop. Even single-celled organisms grow and develop at some point in time. They also respond to their environment. And when we say environment, we're not just talking about the stuff that you see outside, we're talking about a stimulus specifically. You can think about it like this. If I pinch you, you're probably going to flinch. You're going to respond to your environment. All organisms respond to their environment in some way. Even plants respond to their environment. Think about the sunflowers. Flowers can actually change position to where they shift and they can orient themselves towards the sun. Additionally, they respond to sunlight by undergoing photosynthesis. We don't always see or recognize the response, but a response is taking place. We also have organisms that are going to need to maintain an internal balance. This internal balance is something called homeostasis. Homeostasis is basically a stable internal environment. And you can think about it like this. If your homeostasis is off balance, you're most likely going to die. My best example is if you get a really high fever, let's say a fever over 104 or 105, you're going to throw off your homeostasis or your homeostatic balance. This can lead to things like seizures and brain damage because your body's not meant to live at 105 degrees. You're meant to live anywhere from like 95 to 99, right? That's going to be homeostasis. And your body has ways to regulate homeostasis. Homeostasis for you is going to be different than homeostasis from a plant or homeostasis from a bacterium, but a stable internal balance or a stable internal environment is essential for being a living organism. And last but not least, organisms evolve or they change over time. Now, I'm not talking about you're all of a sudden going to wake up one morning with an arm growing out of you. No, individuals don't technically evolve that efficiently over time. Instead, minor modifications and whole populations can change over an extended period of time. So we see that something happens and you change and your population changes. You grow and develop, you respond to your environment, you're made up of DNA. All of these collectively are characteristics of living things. So if you want to stop and ask yourself, gee, is that alive? You can run through this list. Can they do these things? Are they made up of these things? Why bother even talking about living things? Why not just cut straight to the chase and dive into the biological processes that we want to study so bad? Well, biology is the general study of life. It helps to know what's living before we start studying living things. Now, you're going to study a lot of non-living things too. We'll talk about the difference between abiotic and biotic factors later, but it's important that you're able to differentiate the living things versus the non-living things. But that brings us to my next point, is the fact that biology is a huge category. In fact, biology can be broken down in and of itself to microbiology and genetics, bioengineering, cellular biology. All of these things are all still part of the umbrella that is biology. So we can also talk about the cross-cutting concepts that are found in biology. When you study biology, you're not just studying one thing. You're studying a much bigger, broader picture of science. Some of those things you'll study are cause and effect, systems and system models, stability and change, patterns, scale, proportion and quantity, energy and matter, and structure and function. All of these are things that are included in this subject. And not all of these things are living things. A lot of these things are ideas or concepts. So we'll study cause and effect. We'll talk about mechanism and explanation. This is kind of a way of knowing. And this is something that you should have learned last year. Cause and effect is always a kind of, if I do this, then what's going to happen? And this is the basis of a lot of the labs you'll be completing. You'll also study system and system models. Even you as an individual are considered a system, and we've developed models to help us study, for example, the human body, right? We've developed models to help us study the cell. So we'll talk about systems and system models. We'll also talk about stability and change. Remember, one of the major features of being alive is homeostasis. Well, homeostasis is this idea of stability. And then what happens in change? There's lots of different types of change, and it can be good or bad. So what happens if change does occur, and is the effect positive or negative? We'll also talk about patterns, and there's lots of different patterns in biology, from linear patterns to cyclic patterns. An example of a linear pattern, the increase of complexity as you move through the tree of life, or growth in an organism. An example of a cyclic pattern would be something like the seasons. For example, you start school in the summer, then it goes into fall, and then you have winter and spring, and you're back at summer again, right? That's a cyclic type pattern. You'll also study things such as scale, proportion, and quantity. This will be especially important in your beginning units when you start studying things like ecology. And things like scales are important. And when I say scales, I don't mean the ones that you stand on, but I mean the things that you compare other organisms to. We can't necessarily study something on a small size, so we blow it up in size and we change the scale at which we're viewing something. We'll also look at energy and matter, things like flows and cycles and conservation, some of the stuff you'll look at in your very first few units. A lot of that might be familiar from last year when you studied things like energy and matter. So we already see an overflow from things like the physical sciences, where you experienced chemistry and physics, and now you're going to take it into the living world of biology. We'll talk about where organisms get their energy, where organisms go, and how matter cycles through an organic system. So all of this is intertwined. We'll also talk about structure and function. You can't have one without the other. So we'll talk about what's the structure and how does it impact the function? Why is the structure designed in a certain way to function the way it does? This becomes especially important when we start talking about the cell. One of the things you'll learn about is the cell membrane. It has a very specific structure and it functions in a very specific way in order to allow cells to do the jobs that they do. So there are a lot of things that we'll look at in biology. Some of them will be living and some of them will be non-living, but all of them are relevant to your studies. If you want a quick review, you can check out this video by the Amoeba Sisters. It has a little more detail on the characteristics of life, and the Amoeba Sisters are super duper fun. You can either click the link or you can just Google search the Amoeba Sisters, the characteristics of life, and the video will pop up. It's a great opportunity to review what you know or fill in any gaps if you need a little bit more information. So we come to the end of our first and nice short review video. Ask yourself, can you identify the characteristics of living things? Do you remember what they are? How can you tell apart a living organism from a non-living organism? And can you describe the cross-cutting concepts in biology? That means, what is biology and how do other subjects play a role? And what are some of the different things we'll be studying, living or non-living? I hope that your first review video has been a good time and has really been beneficial for you. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Have a great day.